gentlemen. Welcome to today's Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights Sunday session. We have several of these planned for the next few months, and this is the first of what will be several great sessions that are outside our normal meeting time of 6:30 to 8:30 on Monday nights. Today, we are pleased and honored to welcome to our school this afternoon Dr. Justene Hill Edwards, who has written a fantastic book called Unfree Markets, the Slaves Economy, and the Rise of Capitalism in South Carolina. Now, before she gives her remarks this afternoon, I want to give you some brief background on Dr. Edwards. She's an assistant professor of history at the University of Virginia. She received her Ph.D. from Princeton in 2015, and she specializes not just in African-American history, but in the histories of slavery and capitalism. And her talk today really deals with that particular intersection of really two of the major moments we talk about in our class. Of course, the rise of slavery and racial slavery in South Carolina, and the rise of capitalism in South Carolina as well. Dr. Hill Edwards is also working on a new book called The Economy of the Freed People, which is about the Freedmen Savings and Trust Company, also known as the Freedmen's Bank. So we're very excited to hear more about her research this afternoon. Now, keep in mind, at the end of her talk, there will be time for Q&A. When we get to that point, please put your questions in the chat so that we can flow through them in an orderly manner. And now I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Hill Edwards. And once again, welcome to today's Modjeska School session on Sundays.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello from Charlottesville, Virginia. I am happy to be here and happy to be talking about a topic that I find just fascinating, a topic that has really captured my interest and has really guided my life in many ways over the past 10, 12 years. First, I want to thank Professor Greene and Brett for inviting me to share a little bit about my research, and I look forward to what I'm sure will be a robust and fruitful conversation after my comments. And so, with that being said, let's do a little screen sharing. Okay, and everybody's good. We can see the slide. Are we good? Perfect. Okay, so again, I am so excited to be talking about a topic that has really captured my attention for a while. I am excited about the opportunity to speak with you a little bit, not just about the history of slavery and the evolution of capitalism in South Carolina, but what I'm really interested in, especially towards the end of my talk, is connecting this history to what we see today, really the influence of economic and wealth inequality today, and the vestiges of slavery and its connections to capitalism during the period of legal slavery in South Carolina. And so with that being said, I am going to start with a woman named Venus. So Venus's first appearance in the historical record occurs in November 1755, when her enslaver, John Bruce, described her as a, quote, little Negro girl, unquote, with an iron on each leg. Bruce called attention to young Venus because she ran away, and he wanted to have her apprehended and brought to Charleston's workhouse to retrieve her. But this would not be Venus's final attempt to escape. Less than a year later, this is what you see here. Venus actually tried to escape again in August of 1756. Young Venus left Bruce's plantation again, and he assumed that she was being harbored by a free woman of color in Charleston named Judith. She may have returned to Bruce on her own volition or was captured because Venus fled for a final time 2 years later in 1758. And I love this advertisement here. Again, this is from August 12th, 1756. And I'm looking at my screen right here. And where the red arrow meets, it says a Negro girl named Venus belonging to Mr. John Bruce. Has on an Osnaburg that was a type of fabric jacket and coat, takes up free Judith's up on the path. And so this is kind of an announcement of young Venus's whereabouts. So having escaped for 7 years after her final escape in 1758, Venus lived under various pseudonyms, including Free Hannah and Free Mary, to disguise her true identity. During her 7-year absence, she had 3 children and created a home for herself near Charleston. She was working as a washerwoman employed illicitly by white families in the city. And again, it was not uncommon for bondswomen to find work as washerwomen actually in colonial Charleston. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Enslaved women were pretty good at creating economic niches for themselves in cities such as Charleston, using and deploying their entrepreneurial skills to support themselves and their families. And Venus counted herself among this group in the hustling and bustling port city of Charleston in the 18th century. And it is possible that she began to cultivate relationships with other free and enslaved Black people in the city during her various attempts to escape and to live free. In the summer of 1765, the executors of her enslaver, the recently deceased John Bruce, wanted to include her and presumably her enslaved children in the sale of Bruce's land and property holdings that included Bruce's enslaved property. And where did they believe that Venus, as a part of his property holdings, resided? They believed that she was, quote, lately seen in Charleston's famed lower marketplace, a place where enslaved people frequently bartered, traded, haggled with any customer who wanted to purchase their goods, and not far from Charleston's famed slave market. So Venus must have understood both the power and the limitations of her economic endeavors and the connections that these economic endeavors had to her pursuit of freedom. And so on the one hand, she fled, living or attempting to live as a semi-free woman for 7 years, providing for herself and her family and taking advantage of every economic opportunity at her fingertips through her own courage and her own enterprise. On the other hand, her persistence could not secure what she must have desired most for herself and her 3 children, their legal freedom, a goal that she pursued for herself from her childhood. She must have lived under the constant fear of being captured and taken back by Bruce. And this must have shaped her lives and how she made economic decisions. And so the historical record does not reveal if Venus gained her freedom or if she and her family were caught, only to be returned to be included in Bruce's list of assets. Nevertheless, Venus's experience can help us understand the complexities of and the inherent dangers in enslaved African quest for freedom, especially within the increasingly capitalist economy of slavery in colonial South Carolina. And so while she surely understood that cultivating economic literacy was crucial to her survival, she must have quickly realized that her participation in the local marketplace of labor could not provide her or her family with full freedom or security. She actually learned the limits of her investments in economic enterprise and perhaps her investments in capitalism, that these investments would not be able to secure what she wanted most, which was her freedom. And so it may appear as though Venus's experience with running away and attempting to earn money was out of the ordinary, but it was not. The historical record, especially in South Carolina, is peppered with examples of the enslaved figuring out how to earn wages, buy goods, accumulate property. They were trying to make their lives better within the violence and exploitation of slavery, within the rise of capitalism. And so through looking at a variety of records, we can see the dynamic relationship between slavery and the evolution of capitalism in South Carolina. And this is particularly true if we look at the experiences of enslaved people such as Venus. So that's going to be my focus for this afternoon, to connect the histories of slavery and the histories of capitalism in South Carolina from the top down, from those with political and economic power, but importantly for my purposes and for the overall goal for this afternoon, from the ground up, examining the history of slavery and the history of capitalism through the lives and perspectives of the enslaved. And I will try to keep track of time too. So the economy of slavery and really the history of slavery began in South Carolina's colonial period, really from the founding of South Carolina in 1670. So in my work, I focus on South Carolina for a variety of reasons. First, because it was founded as the first slaveholding colonies, then the states that would become the United States. And so South Carolina was founded first and foremost for investment in slavery as an economic enterprise. Second, of course, because South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union after Lincoln's election as president in 1860. And so in many ways, South Carolina is the perfect place to study this convergence between the history of slavery and the history of capitalism in America. But if we look at the early history of Carolina as a colony, it is clear that this history has both slavery and emerging forms of capitalism at its very core, at its foundation. And we must, of course, start in Barbados, the beautiful colony of Barbados. And the connections between Barbados and South Carolina run deep. In 1627, a small group of white English colonists with an even smaller group of enslaved Africans colonized Barbados. After less than 20 years, Barbados was one of England's most populous colonies in the West Indies, with approximately 30,000 mostly white indentured servants laboring on the island colony. By the 1640s, Barbadian planters began to experiment with sugarcane cultivation. In those first 20 years of colonization, these colonists attempted to cultivate a variety of products, a variety of crops, but it was really the introduction of sugarcane that helped to catapult Barbados and Barbadian sugar to prominence within the Atlantic economy. And so this product, sugar, proved to be a massive financial success. With the rise in sugar cultivation came a need expressed by wealthy planters for a steadier source of labor. Sugar planters came to rely more and more by the 1650s and 1660s on enslaved Africans as laborers, as white laborers and commodities, as laborers and commodities, because they had a hard time actually recruiting white indentured servants to work in the difficult and often dangerous conditions of sugar cultivation in the West Indies. By 1660, the demographics of Barbados had shifted dramatically to approximately 27,000 enslaved Africans and 26,000 white colonists. And so the combination of this massive population increase, especially the increase of enslaved Africans and the massive amounts of capital that investors and enslavers were making in sugar, had important and visible consequences. The introduction of capitalist investment encouraged enslavers and future plantation owners to buy as much land and slaves as possible. This also meant, though, that because Barbados was an island colony with limited space, enterprising investors could not bet their long-term economic futures on slavery and on sugar in Barbados. And so 8 Lord proprietors, also known in Carolina as the Goose Creek Men, acquired land grants from King Charles II in 1663 to transplant the Barbadian model of capitalist investment in land, in sugar, and in African slave labor to the British holdings in colonial mainland North America, specifically the land between Virginia and Spanish Florida. And so south of Virginia, north of Spanish Florida. These 8 Lord proprietors called the newly established colony Carolina. And so enslavers created a colony that was created fully to support the growth of African slavery. This lasted, again, about 2 centuries, and in many ways, white South Carolinians were in the vanguard of pro-slavery political and economic advocates during that period of time. On the other hand, it was enslaved Africans transported from Barbados and regions of the Atlantic African world who introduced their unique ideas of culture, life, and interestingly enough, economic activity to the colony. And so all of that is to say that in the colonial period, interestingly enough, enslaved Africans brought with them their own ideas about how to engage in the economic lives of the places in which they were enslaved. The enslaved worked the plantations that grew rice and indigo in the South Carolina Low Country, and the tens of thousands of enslaved Africans contributed to the burgeoning and real growing Carolina economy in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so if we look at this advertisement, I think it kind of perfectly encapsulates in many ways how not just slavery, but the slave trade helped to catapult South Carolina into Atlantic prominence in the colonial period. And if we look at this advertisement again, we can begin to understand more clearly the relationship between slavery, capitalism, and the colonial economy in South Carolina. And so it says here, of course, to be sold on board the ship on Tuesday, the 6th of May, a choice cargo of about 250 fine, healthy Negroes. And this is the part that I find particularly interesting, just arrived from the Windward and Rice Coast, right? And so the Windward Coast is modern day Ghana. The Rice Coast, though, is modern day Senegal and Gambia. And so the thousands of enslaved Africans kidnapped, sold, and bought from the Rice Coast, again, modern day Senegal and Gambia in particular, carried across the Atlantic Ocean to the Carolina Low Country, ideas about, again, culture, about their economic lives, but importantly, about the tradition of rice cultivation. And so by 1700, most of the thousands of enslaved Africans were enslaved and working on low country rice plantations. And rice cultivation, interestingly enough, was not native to mainland North America. And I'll talk about this in a couple minutes, but there is some historical debate, a fairly robust historical debate about the origins of rice cultivation in the South Carolina Low Country. I'll get to that in a few minutes, but rice cultivation was a fairly long process, a year-long process. And interestingly enough, rice comprised from a half to about 70% of South Carolina exports in the 18th century. So this means that rice was a major export product of the Low Country, and that rice was overwhelmingly produced by enslaved Africans. And so there is a direct connection, again, between the wealth, the capital that was generated in South Carolina in the colonial period and the labor, the bodies, and the lives of enslaved Africans who catapulted South Carolina rice, really Carolina gold rice, to global prominence. And so we have this idea of rice cultivation being a laborious, a slow process, a process that required, in many instances, highly technical skills that required planting, systems of irrigation, weeding, and harvesting. And again, all of this was done by enslaved Africans. And so interestingly enough, to understand the ways in which rice cultivation was at the very foundation of economic life in colonial South Carolina, we also kind of have to understand the ways in which labor, really the labor of enslaved Africans, helped to shape the kind of economy of slavery in colonial era South Carolina. And so labor was organized in the colonial period in South Carolina around what historians like myself call the task system. And so under this system, enslaved men and women were assigned to a certain amount of work per day or week based on a variety of factors, based on the time of year, based on gender, based on age, and based on perceived physical ability. And so when the work was completed, enslaved men and women could spend their quote unquote free time, and I say free time because it is a kind of a fraught concept, but they would spend their free time as they wished. This type of labor system was by and large self-regulated by the enslaved, which meant that the enslaved were not under the direct supervision of an enslaver or an overseer. And so this kind of structure of labor organization ultimately began to shape the ways in which enslaved Africans thought about their labor, thought about their time, and in some ways thought about their investments on a small scale in forms of capitalist enterprise and entrepreneurship. And so again, tasking, the task system was the most prominent form of labor organization on low country rice plantations. And this increasingly became a system that the enslaved sought to hold on to quite tightly. And so interestingly enough, during the American Revolution, for example, when enslavers who decided to stay on their plantations attempted to kind of encourage or at times forced their enslaved laborers to adopt other forms of labor or organization, the enslaved would push back and say, no, if we are working here, then we are going to work by the ways in which we had been working for a generation at this point. And so the task system became a very visible way in which the enslaved sought to kind of negotiate with their enslavers. Oh, I want to make sure I am keeping track of time. Okay, good. So all of this is to say that the economy of rice cultivation, the labor system that evolved, and the rise of South Carolina as one of the wealthiest colonies in British colonial America was a result of the labor, but really the influx of enslaved Africans as the primary labor force in the colonial period. And so with the founding of the colony in 1670, there were about 30 enslaved Africans in the colony, a relatively small amount, 15% of the total population, white colonists in the Black population. By 1690, that number rose to 1,500, which comprised 38% of the colony's population. And by the 1720s, South Carolina had what the great South Carolina historian Peter Wood called a Black majority. Over 70% of the population by 1720 was Black, the majority of which was an enslaved population. And then if we kind of go down these numbers, even during the American Revolution, there is still a Black majority here. And so this should tell us of the influence of enslaved Africans, not just on the culture of South Carolina and the culture of slavery, but on the economy of slavery in this important period in South Carolina history. And so interestingly enough, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, with regard to the cultivation of rice in the Low Country, there has been a quite vigorous debate about the origins of rice cultivation in the Low Country. Some historians believe that the proliferation of rice happened as a result of enslaved Africans importing knowledge from rice cultivating regions of West Africa, modern day Senegal and Gambia, for example. And the generational knowledge that enslaved Africans brought with them, especially the generational knowledge brought with enslaved women, were used to create this very wealthy economy of rice cultivation in South Carolina during the colonial period. And this is a claim that that is explained more by a scholar named Judith Carney in her award-winning book called Black Rice. It's an amazing read. There are other historians that believe that it was kind of European technological development of specific rice cultivation techniques that really accounted for the boom in Carolina gold. But these two perspectives, I think, are really important, especially the first one, kind of made more popular by scholar Judith Carney, to really understand the contributions, again, of enslaved Africans to the rise and the wealth generated in South Carolina, really even the ways in which investors began to invest capital in the growth of the low country rice economy in the colonial period. But despite these foundations, it caused, again, enslaved men and women to become a majority of the residents in the 18th century. And as the previous chart showed on the previous slide, the fact that enslaved Africans comprised 70% of South Carolina's population, again, tells us of their visible influence on the kind of growth and the wealth generated during the colonial period. And so overall, the spread of slavery and the increasing numbers of African slaves brought and sold from West Africa and the West Indies to regions of the colonial Americas began to, again, change the demographic landscape of places like South Carolina. And that is to say that as more enslaved Africans came into the colonies, came into South Carolina, so too did ideas of insurrection and rebellion. And so the fact that slavery as an economic, social, and legal institution became more entrenched in South Carolina in this period did not mean that the enslaved did not resist. They did, and sometimes in violent ways. We can examine one of the major slave insurrections during the colonial period in South Carolina to use as an example. So on September 9th, 1739, a group of enslaved Africans congregated in Charleston, shouting words of liberty, and they were essentially ready to liberate themselves by any means necessary. So led by an Angolan man named Jemmy, the men and women continued to walk south of Charleston, recruiting more enslaved men and women along the way. And by the time they stopped to rest for the night, their numbers had approached approximately 100. And so what exactly triggered what is known as the Stono Rebellion is not all that clear. Many enslaved Africans knew that small groups of runaways had made their way from South Carolina to Spanish Florida, where they had been given freedom and land. Looking to cause unrest with the English colonies, the Spanish had essentially declared a proclamation stating that any enslaved person who deserted to St. Augustine, Florida, would be given the same treatment, would be given freedom and land. Certainly, this influenced potential rebels and made them willing to accept the risks of escaping, the risks of fleeing. But what this did was perhaps was incite a group of courageous enslaved Africans in Charleston on that September day in 1739 to take their freedom, again, by any means necessary. And so around 4 in the afternoon on the following day, somewhere between 20 to 100 white South Carolinians had set out in armed pursuit of the enslaved Africans. When they approached the enslaved men and women, the slaves fired 2 shots. The white South Carolinians returned fire, bringing down about 14 slaves. By dusk, about 30 slaves were dead, and at least 30 had actually escaped. Most were captured over the next month and then subsequently executed. The rest were captured over the following 6 months, all but one who remained a fugitive for about 3 years. So ultimately, white South Carolinians wanted to place more restrictions on the enslaved. Again, the fear of slave insurrection was ever present in slave holding colonies, not just in South Carolina, but in general. Whites were uncomfortable with the increasing numbers, again, of enslaved Africans in the colony. And they had been working to encourage lawmakers to create stronger laws that they hoped would limit the privileges of the enslaved. This act was quickly finalized and approved after the rebellion. And according to the law, The enslaved would not be allowed to grow their own food, assemble in groups, earn their own money, or learn to read, because all of these activities, literacy, the ability to earn money, the fear of Blacks congregating in groups, seemingly threatened the stability and foundations of slavery in the colony. Some of these restrictions had actually been in effect prior to 1739, but they had not been strictly enforced. So interestingly enough, in the aftermath of the Stono Rebellion, these kind of claims, these charges to curtail the spreading of rebellious ideas among the enslaved actually did not work. Because in fact, the enslaved would continue to find ways to gather together, to form their own religious communities, and to even find ways to make and earn their own money. And it was really enslaved people's continued efforts to create their own economic networks and to make their own money that would actually help to support the growth of capitalism in South Carolina. And so this is kind of where I'm bringing in a bit of my own research here, a question, a topic that I just find endlessly fascinating. In the Low Country, actually from the first moment that enslaved Africans were bought and purchased by Carolina enslavers, the enslaved had been finding ways to actually trade on their own, to purchase goods that they wanted or needed, and in general, attempt to make money for themselves. This is what historians like myself call the slaves economy, or the economy of the enslaved. The enslaved achieved a degree of economic independence, producing food for themselves, tending cash crops, raising livestock, making furnished goods, marketing their own products, consuming and saving the proceeds, and bequeathing property to their descendants. And yes, enslaved men and women actually took advantage of opportunities to possess property in an attempt to pass down that property to members of their family after their death. And again, all of these activities correspond, interestingly enough, with ideas that historians like myself believe correspond quite directly to the rise of capitalism. And these types of activities occurred all over the Atlantic world, not just in South Carolina, but it was particularly prominent among enslaved men and women in the Low Country. Enslaved Africans took advantage of the small bits of free time that they had to go to the Charleston marketplace, for example, to go to the lower market and haggle and barter their own goods. And these activities were actually protected by enslavers who found economic benefits from allowing and even encouraging their slaves to engage in these types of economic exchanges. The slaves economy, interestingly enough, was another aspect of slavery that enslaved Africans and enslavers brought with them from Barbados. The enslaved created economic networks in Bridgetown, for example, as they would in Carolina, out of necessity, trading with whites who were free and trading with servants whenever possible. Enslaved Africans in 17th century Barbados took advantage of opportunities to develop networks of trade with anyone willing to trade or engage economically with them. And the numbers of enterprising enslaved Africans actually increased as they quickly began to, again, replace the numbers of white indentured servants. And so in a way, the Barbadian shift from white indentured servants to African slave labor actually helped to not just kind of grow this slave economy and the economy of slavery, but really grow the networks of trade in which the enslaved were involved. And so, interestingly enough, as the slaves economy continued to grow both in Barbados and in Carolina, lawmakers attempted to, interestingly enough, not eliminate these types of activities, but attempted to kind of curtail them. And so the first law created in Carolina in 1686 was called an act inhibiting the trading with servants or slaves. And so the networks of economic trade that enslaved Africans cultivated, again, was an interestingly visible aspect of the rise of capitalism in South Carolina. And it was put on public display. And I think that this law is a great example of that. And so the statute actually attempted to rein in slaves and servants' engagement in what lawmakers called indirect bargains, specifically with free whites. Carolina lawmakers wrote that the working classes, both Black and white, adventured privately to embezzle their master's goods and were responsible for, quote, nourishing and introducing vice into the young colony. And so even though this law was created to kind of curtail, to rein in the slaves economy, it is clear that it did not work. And that's because enslavers were actually protecting the enslaved in the ways in which they attempted to engage in these types of trade and activities. And I think one of the best examples of this comes from the 1770s. It is clear that these laws just did not work. And so in the 18th century, specifically in 1772, this comes from a visitor to Charleston who was walking around the lower market and is just talking about the visibility and the boisterousness of enslaved African women as they engaged in trade. And this is what it says: I have seen these Negro women surround fruit carts in every street and purchase amongst them the whole contents to the exclusion of every white person. And they are your slaves who fix the exorbitant prices, which are given for most of the articles that are bought at the lower market, where scarcity but Black butchers are employed. And I find this fascinating. Here, I'll go. Let me do that. Okay, now I'll go back here. I find this fascinating because I think it shows not just the visibility, but the control that enslaved African women were attempting to wield in this very public space. We often think of market women as kind of being in the shadows, perhaps, but in Charleston, in the colonial period, they were front and center. They were bartering and haggling with whites. They were fixing prices. They were deciding who to sell to and what customers would pay. And so this tells me a bit more about the economic literacy that enslaved African women cultivated and were putting on very public display in a very public part of Charleston in the colonial period. And so I love this. Yes, and this is just a picture from 1860 later of the type of visibility that Black women had in Charleston in this very, very public space. In many ways, Black women, enslaved women, were very active participants in the rise and in the growth of capitalism in South Carolina, even on a small but a very visible scale. And so here, let me see how I am in terms of time. Brett or Professor Greene, if I need to curtail this, please don't hesitate to chime in. Okay, and so I'm going to kind of shift a little bit briefly from the colonial period, but I think it's important. It is difficult to talk about the rise of slavery and the rise of capitalism without talking about probably the most important product for the economic growth of the United States in the 19th century, and that was cotton. And in the late 18th century, in the period after the American Revolution, with the talk of freedom and liberty swirling around them, the enslaved were encountering dramatic changes to their lives. And this change revolved around the introduction of, again, a product that would dramatically transform not just their lives, but the American economy and the institution of slavery, and that product was short staple cotton. And the economy of South Carolina was dominated again by slave grown rice in the colonial period. And rice was the largest export of South Carolina in the 18th century. But after the patenting of the cotton gin in 1793, and the explosion of the cotton industry at the beginning of the 19th century, South Carolina's export economy, and therefore the economy of slavery, shifted. One traveler to South Carolina in 1805 remarked that cotton had become king. He mentioned the staple commodity of the state is rice, but cotton is now eagerly cultivated. It is to the crop of cotton that the planter looks for the augmentation of his wealth. And so while in the colonial period, rice continued to really catapult the South Carolina economy, short staple cotton began to take up a larger share of South Carolina exports in the 19th century. And this shift dramatically affected the lives of the enslaved. The experiences, in the words of one enslaved person, really illustrates how the introduction of cotton harvesting technologies, really with the cotton gin, changed the economy of slavery in South Carolina at the beginning of the 19th century. And so in 1805, one of the greatest fears of an enslaved person came true for a man named Charles Ball. His enslaver sold the 30-year-old man to a slave trader bound for the Carolinas in Georgia, far from his family in Maryland. Ball was funneled into the domestic slave trade, or the Second Middle Passage, as historians like to call it, during a period, again, of dramatic economic growth and change in America. The introduction of the cotton gin, and again, the rapid expansion of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase dramatically transformed the landscape of slavery, and it upended the lives of thousands of enslaved men and women like Ball. And so in 1837, Ball publishes Slavery in the United States after his escape to freedom. And he wrote that in Maryland, the enslaved took on waged work mainly at night and on Sundays. And he wrote, if they chose to fish, they had the privilege of selling whatever they want. And the enslaved in Maryland would buy luxuries from, excuse me, coffee and sugar to clothes for their wives. When Ball reached at the end of his harrowing journey on foot to South Carolina, when he reached South Carolina, he noticed a dramatic change. He noticed, excuse me, that the enslaved were investing so much of their time and energy into making money, much like they did in Maryland. But slavery in South Carolina differed in dramatic ways. Excuse me, the sheer ubiquity of enslaved laborers dedicating their free time to waged labor absolutely stunned him. And he began to kind of witness what was the catalyst for this. He wrote that when the slaves go out to work for wages on Sunday in South Carolina, their employers never flogged them. This practice of working on Sunday is so universal amongst the slaves on the cotton plantations that the immorality is never spoken of. And so he immediately witnesses the fact that he's making a connection between South Carolina's cotton economy and how the enslaved continue to engage in their own economic pursuits. And so not only did the presence of the slaves' economy surprise Ball, but the sheer popularity of cotton did as well. He wrote that little attention was paid to the cultivation of anything else but cotton. And he spent most of his time in South Carolina, not in the Low Country, interestingly enough, but in and around Columbia. And so he wrote that this plant was almost the sole possessor of the fields. It covered the plantations adjacent to the road, excuse me, as far as I could see, both before and behind me, and looked not unlike buckwheat before it blossoms. And so he was essentially witnessing the transformations that were occurring in the American economy of slavery, but specifically in South Carolina, the ways in which enslavers and investors were investing more and more capital, acquiring more and more credit from financial institutions to buy more land and more slaves and more machinery to attempt to profit from this, by this point, this global demand for American short staple cotton from the South. Let's see, let me look at my time. Okay, so I'm going to skip forward a little bit, if that's okay. I have some very interesting slides about the ways in which enslavers thought about their trade with slaves. This is from an overseer talking about how he allows his enslaved laborers to buy and sell goods with him, and how it was not seen as anything but necessary to help his investments in slavery remain profitable. And this is from an enslaver, Charles C. Pinckney, the namesake of the South Carolina delegate to the Constitutional Convention. And he talks about how he kept an account book of his trades with slaves and how he saw it as being a fairly rational way of ensuring that he kept track of the trade and that he was actually profiting from his buying and selling goods with his slaves. But to end, I want to jump a little bit to the period of Reconstruction. And so I know that this is a talk on slavery in colonial South Carolina, but I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about what happens after the end of legal slavery. And so here, I'm going to talk about this through the experiences of a formerly enslaved man. And these are going to be my final set of comments. What you see here is it's a map of Beaufort, South Carolina. And so on March 14th, 1870, an African-American man walked along Bay Street in Beaufort, South Carolina. And that's Bay Street right there. As he strolled past the shops and homes that dotted the unpaved thoroughfare, he passed facades weathered by the mayhem inflicted by the Civil War. Beaufort was one of the first cities to fall to the Union Army during the war, which set the stage for the emancipation of the region's enslaved population, of which the man was a member. As he sauntered past fellow residents, both Black and white, again, this is 1870, perhaps he contemplated how Bay Street looked a mere 5 years earlier as the Civil War and legal bondage came to an end. The remnants of slavery lingered on Bay Street. Houses and shops once owned by ex-Confederates lined the gravel-filled road. Beaufort was, again, a bustling port city in its heyday, rivaling Charleston and Georgetown. And it was home to the nation's richest families, again, during the first half of the 19th century. These slave-holding families were building generational wealth through investing in Carolina's major export, of course, Carolina gold rice. They tapped into national and international banking networks to finance their investments in rice cultivation and further up country on short staple cotton plantations. Beaufort's enslavers formed relationships with bankers as far away as New York and London, from whom they requested lines of credit to buy more enslaved laborers. The African-American men surely remembered the ships docked at the Beaufort Harbor and the enslaved laborers who loaded rice onto vessels headed to New York, New Orleans, and Liverpool. And he perhaps thought about how his labor contributed to helping white families pouring capital into maintaining their investments and the profitability of slavery. And the African-American man was owned by one of these families. The man was walking along the street, again, along Bay Street, and he marched up the small flight of stairs in this E-Crew building with a two-story portico. This man who lived through the unpredictability of slavery must have felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension because the building that he entered was a bank. And this bank was no ordinary financial institution, and because it served a particularly vulnerable but optimistic population of people, which were African Americans recently freed from slavery. And the formerly enslaved man entered the Beaufort, South Carolina branch of the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, also known as the Freedmen's Bank. And the bank was a private financial institution chartered by Congress in the final months of the Civil War. With the stroke of a pen, President Lincoln signed the bank into existence on March 3rd, 1865, one day before his second inauguration and 1 month before his assassination. And the bank was celebrated by white Americans and Black Americans alike, who celebrated the financial institution as one of Lincoln's crowning achievements, even touting it as Lincoln's, quote, gift to the colored people. And so the branch that the man walked into was opened in October 1866. Let's see. So on that day in March 1870, when the African-American man entered the Beaufort branch of the Freedmen's Bank to open an account, he was essentially absorbing the bank's message that opening an account would help formerly enslaved people like him assimilate into the body politic through embracing the benefits of American capitalism. He was surely hoping that his investment in the financial institution would help his climb into the period of freedom. But what bank administrators did not understand was that the enslaved and the formerly enslaved had been cultivating ideas about their role within the American economy for generations. And they did not necessarily need to be introduced to American capitalism through banking. But some of you may know who the African-American man was because he gained notoriety during the American Civil War. The man's name was Robert Smalls, and Smalls catapulted himself to national prominence for his gallant actions during the war. On the evening of May 12, 1862, the 23-year-old Smalls snuck aboard a commandeered Confederate ship docked in Charleston Harbor, and the Confederate soldiers responsible for manning the ships left it unattended, and he deployed his navigation skills that he cultivated as an enslaved boy and steered it towards a fleet of Union vessels stationed outside of Charleston Harbor. His daring act secured him not only his freedom, but a $1,500 award from the federal government for his heroic actions. And so all of this is to say that men like Robert Smalls were investing in the idea of American capitalism, but from a very different perspective. He had come from generations of enslaved men and women who worked to help build South Carolina's economy of rice and cotton, and really helped to build South Carolina's capitalist economy of slavery. And so I wish I could say that Black depositors such as Smalls, again, use the bank's promise of helping the formerly enslaved buy land, save money, and build economic safety net, but that did not happen. Even though Smalls went on to have a fairly famous a political career, his investment in the bank and ultimately his investment in American capitalism continued to be fraught. And that is because of the history of slavery and capitalism. And so in conclusion, I'm encouraging us to think about how we understand the relationship between capitalist enterprise in the United States and freedom. And really the relationship between capitalism, freedom, race, and the persistent racial wealth gap. Instead, if we look at the experiences of the enslaved, especially in a place like South Carolina, then we get a different message about how much African Americans' investments in capitalism freed them or can free us from the continued legacies of slavery in American society. To fully understand the intersection of racism and capitalism, especially around economic inequality and racial inequality, we need to fully understand the relationship between the rise of American capitalism and how slavery emerged in the United States, and increasingly how it played out in the lives of African Americans such as Robert Smalls, but in the enslaved more broadly. So I will stop there. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm excited about your questions.
All right, thanks so much for a fantastic presentation. That was great. That was as great as I thought it would be. I knew it would be.
Thank
So
you.
we've got a few questions in the chat already. We have an inquisitive audience here, which is a great thing. So I actually want to start the questions off with talking about the actual crops themselves, specifically two crops, sugarcane and indigo. So this actually combines two questions. Could you talk a little bit more about the shift from sugarcane to rice by the original Barbadian planters in Carolina colony? How that shift was done, and then secondly, talk a bit about the role of indigo in the colonial period in Carolina colony as well. So that's our first batch of questions. We've got more coming in right now.
Sure. Well, sugar, especially in the Low Country in the colonial period, proved to not be well suited, especially in relationship to rice. And so the founders of Carolina actually attempted to implement the same type of kind of plantation economy of Barbados to Carolina. And part of that project was the introduction of sugar, but sugar proved to be ineffective, really did not grow well. And so the transition to rice, and interestingly enough, to indigo, proved to be more profitable for enslavers and planters. Indigo, funny enough, was one of those products that proved to be a visible product to be exported in the colonial period. And so along with rice, enslaved Africans were growing indigo as well as a part of the kind of plantation project in their in enslavers' investments in slavery. And so yes, along with rice, indigo was quite popular, but sugar did not do so well, really kind of environmentally. In terms of the kind of colonial projects of slavery in colonial Carolina.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Now here's another question, and I just, for full disclosure, when Brett and I spoke to Dr. Hill Edwards a few days ago about the presentation, she said that she wanted to talk a bit about the Freedmen's Bank, and we all knew she gets some questions about that. And here's one right here. Did Martin Delany have a relationship with the Freedmen's Bank?
Ooh. So I have to say, I am still kind of in the early stages of research, but I think so. There was a prominent group of African Americans from cities like DC and Philadelphia and New York, who white bank administrators attempted to gain the support of. And so I actually believe that Martin Delany was an early supporter of the bank. But him, along with Frederick Douglass, for example, actually went out and advocated for the bank in Black communities. And so there was this message that the bank was a secure and stable financial institution created for the prosperity of African Americans. So.
Wow. And for those in the audience who don't know, Martin Delany was a 19th century abolitionist. He was in the Union Army. He was a friend and ally of Frederick Douglass. Basically, he did it all in the 19th century. Now, with that being said, this is a question about your broader research. How do you define capitalism?
I knew that question was coming. That is always the question. I don't mean to do that because I'm uncomfortable, but yeah. So I did define capitalism as an economic system in which capital is invested and reinvested to generate more capital and more profit. There is this idea that private property is protected traditionally by a federal government or a kind of governmental institution protecting ideas of free enterprise. Now, there has been some debate about the relationship between capitalism and wage labor. I don't think that debate is all that fruitful, because I think it obscures what is essentially a form of labor organization and economic organization that funnels capital into institutions that create more capital and more profit. So that is how I define it. And the ways in which it has evolved in a country like the United States, it is hard to not see, I think, the connections between the fundamental tenets of capitalism and the ways in which slavery evolved, especially at the end of the 18th and into the 19th century.
Right, right. Now, with that being said, I think this is actually a really interesting question. That's sort of a follow-up in some ways from Amber. It's a two-part question. First, can you explain further how enslaved people would obtain property? And then secondly, this is another big question. Also, can you further explain in what ways that the free Black population and the enslaved population's economic networks overlap or interconnect, specifically when it concerns Black women? And Amber adds, I think your work is fascinating, and I certainly agree there.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. Sure, I'll start with the first question. And so the idea that enslaved men and women would possess property, I think, is really important. And so the idea of property possession, especially in enslaved communities, was often an idea that was kind of recognized and respected by those members of a community. And so we are talking about the enslaved, we're talking about enslavers, we're talking about poor whites who actually recognized that an enslaved person had perhaps worked for, had been bequeathed a piece of property or a piece of machinery or livestock. And so it was this idea that property ownership and possession was recognized through a kind of community recognition, I think, is really important. And these types of community recognitions actually translated into a period of freedom, where the formerly enslaved would appeal to Freedmen's Bureau agents saying that, no, this piece of property is mine because it was recognized as being mine from my enslaver, from free Blacks, from poor whites, from working class whites. And so it required the kind of recognition of members of a community. And I find that fascinating, that it kind of complicates our understanding of what property is. Especially the kind of informal ways in which property is recognized within certain communities, especially enslaved communities. And so I think that is fascinating. And so let's see, can you further explain in ways the free Black population and the enslaved? Yeah, and so, I mean, there was most certainly kind of overlapping and interconnections between the enslaved and free Black communities, especially in cities. And so especially in places like Charleston and Columbia. And in many ways, it was those kind of economic connections that actually scared white South Carolinians. They were afraid of free Blacks kind of infiltrating slave communities and in kind of communicating with them ideas of freedom. These were real fears of enslavers, but in many ways, the ways in which especially runaway slaves would seek to find refuge in free Black communities also, according to whites, posed a threat to the stability of slavery, but there was very much overlapping connections between free Blacks and enslaved men and women in South Carolina. And so, so yeah, and we see this again, mostly in places like Charleston and Columbia.
And a very quick follow-up to that question, could enslaved Africans, could they legally really hold onto their property? What was the legal area in terms of holding on the property there for them?
Well, I mean, interestingly enough, the idea that an enslaved person could hold property if their enslaver actually allowed for and recognized that person's claims to property. And so, especially in the antebellum period, enslavers start to come to terms with the fact that to prevent enslaved men and women from running away, that they had to make certain concessions, that violence was not always going to work. And so allowing and recognizing enslaved men and women's claims to property was a way to keep, according to enslavers, was a way to keep enslaved men and women from running away, from inciting insurrection, from destroying machinery. And so it is kind of interesting to see the negotiation happening, especially in the antebellum period, around issues of property between the enslaved and enslavers.
Right now, the following question is one that I think gets at the heart, not just of your talk, but of your book as well. This is from Dr. Gallman. When applied to enslavement, was capitalism positive? I think that's a really provocative question.
That is a provocative question. Well, I will kind of amend that. I'll say when applied perhaps from the perspective of enslavers, then yes, I think that capitalism could have been extremely positive. It was extremely generative by investing profits and capital into expanding one's economic holdings, slaves for example, and really operating within an economic system that allowed for the commodification, not just of slaves' bodies, but of slaves' labor. It meant that capitalism was extremely profitable, especially the federal government not impinging on this type of economic activity. Then I would say yes. On the other hand, I think if we look at the perspective of the enslaved, I would say no. I would say that no matter how much, that it didn't matter how much they invested time and energy, it didn't matter how much they could save. One of the ideas, one of the realities that they strove for was freedom. And so their investment in the basic tenets of capitalism did not garner them freedom, did not garner them the ability in most cases to purchase the freedom of themselves and their families. And so in many ways, the ways in which capitalism evolved with slavery actually made the lives of the enslaved worse.
Right. These are, by the way, I want to tell folks, these are some excellent questions. I feel like I'm back in grad school listening to these questions, but
Me too.
another, well, more so for you since you haven't actually answered them. Now, here's another interesting question that gets the nuts and bolts of cultivation. Rice cultivation on 105 square feet seems awfully small. That would be just over 10 by 10 feet. Am I misunderstanding?
No, you're not misunderstanding. And what it means is that would be probably the smallest amount of land. The enslaver or overseer could add on to that specific kind of space of land, and often did. And so in many ways, it was kind of a starting point.
Definitely makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another question, and I think this gets at some of the things you talk about in your book amongst the enslaved and free people of color. What kind of stratification existed in the social order of the Black population? What effects did that have on their economic interest?
Oh, that's a great question. And so, I mean, in general, this question of stratification, I think, is really fascinating. But interestingly, in my research, the stratification that I found was really based on skill and trade. And so if we think of stratification in terms of an enslaved man being trained as a blacksmith, for example, he would have had more economic autonomy to hire out his labor if an enslaver allowed for that to happen, to kind of travel, to earn money on the side doing this skilled type of work. But I think in many ways, when we think about stratification or class in terms of an enslaved community, that's really what we are talking about, the so-called skilled trades versus the type of work and labor that would have been considered less skilled. But interestingly enough, when we talk about the economic interests of enslaved men and women, I found evidence that so many men and women were attempting to make money and earn wages, from kids finding ways. Like, I start my book Free Markets with a with an enslaved man named Gus Feaster, and he talks about how he used to pick blackberries and sell to a white neighbor for money. And he did this as a child, and he remembered it when he was interviewed in his 90s, and it left an indelible impression on him. And I talk about kind of how he earned money, and how the woman would make wine from his blackberries. But what did he do with his money? He bought candy, of course, because that's what a child would do, right, with money in their pocket. But interestingly enough, I found evidence of this type of economic activity along the age spectrum, along the ability spectrum. And when we talk about gender, the role of market women was incredibly important in bolstering the visibility of the slaves economy in really kind of public ways.
Right, right. Now, in terms of talking about the Black social order and Black stratification and such, I think another interesting question about the larger world of slavery is, speaking of threats to enslavement, how did the Haitian Revolution influence prevailing attitudes?
Oh, that is a wonderful question. And your timing is perfect because I'm lecturing on that this week in my American slavery class. But I talk about, and I frame the Haitian Revolution, or the revolt in Saint-Domingue, in a very particular way. And it relates, interestingly, directly to this conversation about slavery and capitalism. And so in many ways, without the rebellion of enslaved Africans in Saint-Domingue, we wouldn't have the Louisiana Purchase, right? Because Napoleon is strapped for cash and essentially lets go of the Louisiana territory. And it was in this territory that cotton really becomes the major product that investors and planters are investing in. And so in many ways, without the Haitian Revolution, we would not have had the Louisiana Purchase. Without the Louisiana Purchase, we would not have this massive boom in the American cotton industry. But if we talk about kind of threats to enslavement, it is a very fascinating way to look at, again, white fear of slave insurrection. And so around the time of the revolution, really at the end of the 18th century, in the late 1790s, states like South Carolina and Virginia actually begin to ban the importation of foreign slaves, which was just startling. They said, we are going to forego our economic interests with bringing more enslaved Africans into these new states, because we are so afraid of the threat that rebellious slaves from Saint-Domingue will have on our existing slave populations. This was the actual kind of thoughts of enslavers and lawmakers in states, in particular in South Carolina. And so interestingly enough, South Carolina issues a ban on slave imports until 1804, which is fascinating. And then in this 4-year period between 1804 and 1807, they import like 30,000 enslaved Africans. And so they are so afraid of rebellious slaves from Saint-Domingue that they kind of extract themselves from participating in the foreign slave trade for a series of years. And so there was this real fear of rebelliousness, of violence, and of the Haitian Revolution really kind of influencing slave populations. Of course, they didn't need influencing from Saint-Domingue, but that was a real fear of white enslavers in this period.
Right. Yeah, and I don't want to say about the Gallman. Trust me, we'll talk more about that, I think, next week in the
Okay.
Modjeska School as well, because there's some interesting stories about South Carolina specifically, especially around Charleston and their fears of the Haitian Revolution and all of that. Now, this is, I think, an interest. Well, they're all interesting questions, but this one, I think, asks us to zoom out from your presentation and really think more about the legacy of what you're talking about here. This is from Amari. Do you think there is a major distinction in the way African descended Americans, Black folks, have survived and processed the legacy of slavery versus other African descended peoples throughout the diaspora, and specifically the rise of ADOS, or the idea of American descendants of slavery, makes me ask this.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, yes, I mean, I think that this is a complex and complicated question, right? I think that there is a real significance about being a person of African descent in a country, in a nation, in a community where most of those empowered who have economic and political influence don't look like you. And I think that that has had an indelible influence on the Black experience in America. I mean, I often think, what would have happened? Like, what would happen if I gave up American citizenship and moved to a place like Barbados? How would my life, how would my sense of self be different if those around me who are in political economic power are Black? And I think that that influence, really the influence of white supremacy, cannot be understated. And I do think that this has an effect on how we talk about reparations, for example. I think it has an effect on how we talk about economic discrimination, economic inequality, and the racial wealth gap. And I think it is an important, and for some, an uncomfortable part of this legacy of slavery, especially when we layer on top of this the continued influence of white supremacy.
That's a very fascinating answer. And I can assure you, looking at the questions we have left in the chat, uh, these are almost all questions that could be their own talks unto themselves. This
I'll
is
do
this
my
is a
best.
great. There's no pressure at all. This is a really good question. Does the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 18th century change the definition of capitalism, or does it cause capitalism to morph from agricultural to industrial capitalism?
Mm. Oh, I get the sense someone has been reading Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams, which is brilliant. I love it. It stands the test of time. um, let's see. I don't think it changes the definition of capitalism. I mean, there are historians who say merchant capitalism, industrial capitalism. There are so many types of capitalisms nowadays, but I think it is under the same rubric. Um, I don't really see that much of a difference, to be honest with you. I think we are talking about an economic system that thrives off of the investment of capital and the protection by a governmental institution of that type of economic activity. And so I don't really see a difference, at least in my work, from between agricultural and industrial capitalism. I don't really see a difference. But I do think that the ways in which Williams positions this term capitalism has evolved, right? He never says in Capitalism and Slavery that the economic activity of slavery in the British West Indies was capitalist, right? He doesn't say that. He says that the labor of the enslaved is funneled into creating what we could call industrial capitalism in England, and that's one thing. But yeah, I don't really see a difference between industrial capitalism and agricultural capitalism. I see it as evolutions of a certain type of economic institution.
And you don't know this because the question was sent to me directly, but someone had asked another question about whether or not you were familiar with capitalism and slavery. So obviously you've answered that
Oh,
question already.
oh, I teach that all the time.
Nice. Yeah, I think speaking of which, this is actually going back to the earlier questions about the legacy of what you're talking about here, and a legacy of slavery in South Carolina and the Western world. Now, do you think the nostalgic antebellum plantation tour of the Old South in Charleston, which is the number one tourist city in the world, has led to what Omari Fox refers to as the Santa Clausification of the institution. Do you think the cost of living that doesn't afford housing for the food and beverage workers to live in Charleston is a metaphor for capitalism today?
Mm, that's a great question. I mean, I wouldn't call it a metaphor for capitalism. I think it is an evolution, if not an extension, of the type of capitalism that evolved with the evolution of slavery in Charleston and in South Carolina. Yeah, I mean, the recent necessary conversations about the kind of tourism around plantations, I think, is important, because what it has done is really shed a necessary light on the real horrors of these places, right? These places were not created just for the comfort of whites, right? They were created as sites of violence and extraction and exploitation necessarily. Yeah, I mean, I think that there is, in my mind, a discomfort with kind of visiting these places, kind of a celebration of the Old South, as opposed to looking to these historical sites as an example of the ways in which Black labor and Black lives and Black bodies were exploited for profit.
And I think this is a natural follow up to that. Do you think there are any direct implications of your research on today's freedom struggles? You said earlier that from the perspective of slaves, this system perpetuated slavery rather than challenging it. Do you think there are any lessons to apply today in a society that has limited chattel slavery, but remains thoroughly capitalist?
Sure. No, I think it's a great question. Thank you so much for it. I mean, what I am trying to do now, especially with my new work on the Freedmen's Bank, is to think about this kind of cozy relationship that I think we have between capitalism and freedom, and capitalism and democracy. I think there is this kind of language and rhetoric in American culture about how investing in capitalism, investing in the basic tenets of capitalist enterprise can bring one closer to freedom, right? Can bring one kind of a more free life, especially economically, but in particular politically. And I think that what I hope my work does is disrupt that and think that, well, has that really been the case? And I often think about actually professional athletes and the ways in which those at the highest levels of their sports, especially if they are earning millions of dollars in salaries, still complain about the ways in which they are followed by police, still complain about how they perhaps cannot purchase a home in a certain neighborhood or get a loan at a specific interest rate because of race. And I think that these questions are really important, especially considering if we branch out the current racial wealth gap, right? African Americans own about 1% of wealth in America, about half of a percent. And that is similar in scale to the amount of wealth that African Americans possessed after the Civil War, and that is astonishing. And so I think that if we untangle this relationship between capitalism and democratic ideas of freedom, then we will, I think, better understand how race continues to influence who has access to the mechanisms of wealth generation in American society. And historically, that has not been Black and brown people.
Right, right. And I just want to do a quick plug for one of our future sessions as well. We have on April 18th, we have Eric Gallman talking about Southern Negro Youth Congress. And I mentioned that only because in Gallman's work, he talks about how activists in the 1930s and 40s were making some of the same critiques about capitalism that we're hearing this afternoon during this presentation. They're just doing it in a different context. But again, this is one of the through lines of our class, this relationship between race and capitalism that we don't want to miss out on. Okay, another question. This is again from Amber. Did buying from enslaved people rather than buying from their Caucasian counterparts change the perception of the colonists amongst themselves?
Mm, sure. Well, I mean, I think interestingly enough, this is kind of where ideas of capitalism continue to emerge, right? And it disrupts, I think, oftentimes our ideas of class. I think it is just so fascinating and astonishing that in many ways, poor whites or whites that did not own property or slaves would often trade for basic goods like food and clothing with the enslaved. And this trade was often one of the most kind of consistent ways in which poor whites could acquire cheap goods and food products and in livestock, and everybody knew it was going on. And so in many ways it was this type of economic activity that sustained entire communities of what we might call poor whites, especially in a place like South Carolina. um, and so interestingly, what I found in my research is that no, it didn't change their ideas of themselves, which makes kind of poor whites affiliation or poor whites support of the Confederate cause even more interesting in the 1860s. But yes, I mean, it was not at all uncommon for poor whites to trade with enslaved men and women, and it was even not uncommon for enslavers to trade with their enslaved laborers. And so what this tells me is that in many ways, these types of exchanges, these types of economic trades were not seen as being threatening to the stability of slavery. If anything, and it reinforced the stability of the economy of slavery, especially in the 19th century and in the colonial period as well.
Right. Now, I think this is a question that I think gets back to some of the earlier questions about capitalism and race. Does the concept of racial capitalism animate your study of enslaved peoples? Does racial capitalism clearly link the oppression of contemporary capitalism with its foundations in colonialism and enslavement?
Yes, yes. I see we have some of the attendees reading Cedric Robinson, which I think is wonderful. I've lived with the with his Black Marxist tradition for years, and I continue to come back to it and just be astonished at what I missed the other times that I read the book. But yes, I mean, I think that the term racial capitalism is incredibly generative because if anything, it forces us to look at the environment in which, let's say, American capitalism evolved, right? We are talking about an environment in which slavery, especially in many colonies during the colonial period, was a visible, if not foundational institution that helped catapult capitalists to wealth. And so if we understand the ways in which laws, for example, were constructed to protect economic investment and protect slavery, then we have to see how these two ideas overlap in really important and visible ways. And I think slavery is at the heart of that. And so if we understand that enslavers in South Carolina created the colony for the proliferation of slavery, right? And then if we understand that they were investing massive amounts of capital to catapult South Carolina's rice economy to Atlantic world prominence, to global prominence, and we understand that they were making investments to acquire more enslaved labor, then it's hard to untangle this as well, right? Then it is hard to untangle how these kind of major families like the Pinckneys and the Lorens, how they made their wealth. They made their wealth through investments in slavery and slaves. And that is important. That connection is important to understanding, again, this idea of racial capitalism. And it really does prove to be generative for understanding, again, modern questions of the racial wealth gap, for example.
Precisely. And as you mentioned, Cedric Robinson, I couldn't help but grab my copy of Black Marxism off the bookshelf behind me. I think today, between Cedric Robinson and Eric Williams and a bit of Manny
Mhm.
Marable in there,
Mhm.
obviously we have a very well read student group as well, which I greatly appreciate.
I love that.
Speaking of which, what is your thought about Ruth Gilmore's comments that you cannot undo racism without undoing capitalism?
Mm, mm. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think in the American context, in many ways, that is true. I think to understand the kind of the fundamental foundations of racism in America, one has to understand how it is so intertwined with forms of capitalist accumulation. And to really, again, to really understand the history of race and racism in the US, it is hard to not talk about capitalism, to not talk about exploitation, to not talk about divestment from land, right? We are not just talking about people of African descent. We are talking about Native Americans who were violently divested of their ancestral lands, right? This is very important. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that, I think it is hard. And I think it was the Combahee River Collective who were very, very clear about their views and perspectives on capitalism, and how capitalism has reinforced entire forms of discrimination based on race and gender and sexuality for that matter as well. Um, so yeah, and I think it is a Herculean task, but I think these types of conversations are really important.
Right, right. Now, another question about going back to the ideas of Black economic power and interest in this era. What kinds of regulations did the city of Charleston, rather than the state, pass to restrain Black economic interest?
Mhm. Well, the city of Charleston was very interesting in this respect. The city of Charleston in the colonial period would pass laws every 10 to 15 years, attempting to kind of accommodate for the changing landscape of slavery, from mandating that that if enslaved men and women were to trade, that they had to have a pass. If they didn't have a pass, then they had to have kind of explicit permission from their enslaver registered with kind of a market administrator. To the 1760s, with market women and fishermen and men in the skilled trades needing a specific kind of tag or marker to designate that they had permission from their enslaver to engage in certain type of waged work. And so the lawmakers in Charleston were constantly trying to figure out, on the one hand, how to further control the enslaved population, while on the other hand, which was actually more important, not restricting the property rights of enslavers. And the property rights that enslavers had over their enslaved property was supreme. And so if enslavers were fine, even encouraged or forced enslaved men and women to go out and earn wages, then there was little that lawmakers could do to curtail it. And oftentimes lawmakers really didn't even want to. Most of these laws in particular about kind of regulating slaves' economic activities were kind of on paper, but in practice, they were incredibly hard to control. So I find it fascinating. Most of the time, most of these kind of bigger legal changes occurred after slave insurrections. And so mostly after 1740, well, in 1740 after Stono, and then in 1822 and 23 after the Denmark Vesey.
Now, this is another interesting question. What is the relationship between wealth and power? Athletes may bring, make a lot of money, but not power. I mean, think about the DuPonts as well. They may not be as wealthy as Bill Gates, but I would argue DuPonts wield more power. So, what is that relationship between wealth and power? Because I think your work really gets to this in a really in-depth manner.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think especially in the American context, I think there's so many examples of wealth being able to buy political power and leverage. And it is in that political power where laws are made or unmade, where elected officials can be placed and kind of economically supported. And so in many ways, I think that, especially in the American context, there is this relationship between wealth and in particular political power that we continue to see play out in our electoral processes. And we see this happen starting in the colonial period, right? Lawmakers were often those with wealth. Politicians, especially in South Carolina, were those who own property. That is actually really important.
Now, this is another question that we have here that really gets at the white population of South Carolina and the colonies. The role of indentured servants in the U.S. as the English penal colony changed as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Do you have more data on white poverty in the 18th and 19th centuries?
Oh, I actually don't. There is a brilliant historian, Carrie Lee Merritt, who, what is her book?
Masterless Men.
Masterless Men. Thank you. She is an expert on this topic, so I would not dare to speak in her stead. So I would refer you to her brilliant book about this question of white poverty, especially within an environment where slavery is proliferated.
Right, and I'm going to go ahead and put a link to that book in the chat as well, because it is a fascinating book that gets at some of these questions from a different perspective. And actually, what's funny, the very next question is about this too. You tackle some of this in your book. What were the poor white people doing during all of this? Were they protesting the economic unfairness of the system?
Ooh, they were trying to survive. And so in many ways, I think if we talk about kind of in enslaved stratification, I think the stratification of white South Carolinians is as interesting. And so there were, of course, poor whites who did not have access to property or wealth, who were really living, if not in poverty, on the verge of poverty. There were what I call working class whites who were skilled in trades, who interestingly enough were often competing with skilled enslaved laborers for specific jobs. And they were the ones who were actually making the most noise politically about their dwindling economic prospects. There's so much evidence, especially in the 19th century, of white working men's groups who were skilled as blacksmiths or shoemakers protesting to state lawmakers, saying that lawmakers are not protecting the economic interests of working class whites. Instead, they are protecting the economic interests of enslavers who are pushing their skilled slaves to compete with white workers for the same jobs. And there are all of these petitions that they send to state lawmakers talking about how their economic interests are not being protected and what are lawmakers going to do about it. You know, ultimately, lawmakers who, again, own property, own slaves, have political power, really don't care. They respond saying that the laws as written are sufficient. And so we hear the most political noise from this strata of white South Carolinians who don't own property, but aren't poor. So that is kind of a fascinating conversation as well.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Now, bringing it back to the present, what are your thoughts about the irony of profits generated by Nike's Colin Kaepernick ad speaking to muting a player and banning him for his stance, while the NFL and Jay-Z endorse hip hop artists who are largely anti-police, like NWA, Snoop Dogg, Kendrick Lamar, and Eminem kneeling at the Super Bowl?
Oh, goodness. Okay. That is a good question. Look, Nike is a profit generating behemoth. Let's just call it that. And I think that we need to take with a grain of salt the messages of business, of multi-billion-dollar transnational businesses and organizations that have a bit of economic incentive to speak to these social justice issues, but will not go so far as to risk the dividends that they have to pay out to their investors. And so while Nike might post or might publicly support Kaepernick, there was a calculus made in terms of the economic drawbacks and benefits from doing so. And that's what I think about more than the message itself.
Now, bringing us back to the 18th century for a moment, did you find any evidence of significant trade between enslaved individuals and either indigenous populations or other colonial powers, such as Spain and France?
Mm. So interestingly, I didn't find a lot of evidence in South Carolina, but I have no doubt, especially in the upcountry, that there was significant trade. And this is because I am comparing it to evidence found in places like Georgia and Louisiana, and even in places like Jamaica and Barbados. And so even though I didn't find a lot of evidence of this, a couple in the colonial period, I have no doubt that enslaved men and women were trading with Native Americans when possible.
Right, right. Now, I did want to bring Brett in really quickly. I know he had something that he wanted to add as well about the low country perspective. So, Brett, go ahead.
Well, Robert, it's not just my low country fetish. That's the most significant part of my growing up was spent in the marshes down there. But also my concern about capitalism that I've had for 50 plus years. And then the conjunction of those two things and having the opportunity to crash a forum, a Zoom forum at Oxford, where I got to meet Justene Hill Edwards. And I'm figured there'd be like 200 people there at Oxford. This is the American Institute of Oxford University in Cambridge. That was started Bill Clinton's time when he was a Rhodes Scholar. I think he had something to do with it. There were like 5 or 6 people there, and so I got involved and just became a great fan of Dr. Edwards. But what I want to do now is to point out a couple things that come from my experience, my political experience in part, which is what I bring to the Modjeska School, and the question of capitalism that's been raised a couple of times. Those are the dots that we connect with the Modjeska School. Those are the dots that Modjeska connected, and she studied under Du Bois, and it's not new stuff. But what is new is the ruling class, the people with the money, the capitalists in this country, their creativity and flexibility, it's selling it to wage slaves. I mean, if you're not making money off your money, you got a wage. And that means that you're not a capitalist. But there's this, well, actually, probably 70 million people that voted for Trump believe in capitalism because it is an acquisitional thing in their hearts. They want to acquire things. Well, I ain't going to get enough probably to make any rules. But if you look at the morphing in America, from the time when we wrote, the rich white guys from South Carolina helped write the original Constitution, it warned against corporations. Corporations had lifespans for particular purposes. And today I may remind you, and we'll get to this down the road in the Modjeska School, corporations are people. Money is free speech.
Yeah.
So they've changed the nature of it. They've disguised it, just like they have with racism. And we'll look at how South Carolina, this is how I put my pet peeves together, is this phenomenal heavy hand that South Carolina, this little state, has had, not just on the politics of South Carolina, or even just the politics of the United States of America, but the global politics in a large respect. We'll get to the question of the Red Scares and the transition from being able to get away with being a racist, where you then had to like shift some kind of into some ideological frame. We now have the repression being predicated on really fine strains of ideology. And so there's the people that are running this show here in this country, very dangerous, crazy people, but they're very smart and have a lot of smart people working for them. The other thing I wanted to point out was my opportunities of growing up in the Low Country, my high school years in Beaufort, and spending a lot of time in the marsh. And even since then, uh, being in places, actually Capers Island, which belongs to us, it's one of the parks we have, you can't get there except by a boat. And there are still rice dikes there. So the reason that the Goose Creek men figured out to shift from sugarcane to rice it's called the Low Country and the Sea Islands, because you have to flood that and then unflood it. And it's all manual. I mean, I think today they probably have machines that do it, but it's very laborious. And that small plot of land takes a lot of effort. And that the other thing about the Low Country and the places where we were growing rice, one of the interesting paradoxes of South Carolina and our relationship with great wealth is that we have in this state 25% of the undeveloped property on the entire East Coast from Maine to Key West. How'd that happen? Well, really rich people named DuPont and Baruch and Rockefeller, they bought it. I mean, there were these huge plantations all along the coast. And the beneficence of the super rich, much of that had been turned back to be parks. And so we have, you too can go to South Carolina State Parks on the coast and visit 300-year-old rice fields. We'll have a field trip someday. But I did want to mention, Rob, before I kick it back to you, and my deep appreciation of Dr. Edwards, that Sunday the 27th, is that this? That's 2 Sundays from now. We have, we're changing our agenda some, but the agenda was going to have Orville Burton, Vernon Orville Burton, the emeritus scholar of Reconstruction, speaking about Reconstruction and Lincoln's Unfinished Work, one of his fine books. But he just finished a book just in January that is called Justice Deferred. And his co-author is Armand Durfner. And Armand Durfner is a Low Country Charleston attorney who probably has more civil rights victories and certainly in the question of voting rights than anybody living now. And so they're going to take that Sunday the 27th piece, which everybody's invited to, this is a public event, and turn it into lifting up the pieces in the book that they've done about the Supreme Court cases and the court cases that have come out of South Carolina defending racism over the generations that directly refute the legislature's attempt to punish people for thinking that there's any kind of relationship between judicial decisions and structure, systemic questions of racism. So that's the 27th, and we'll send notes. If you're here today, you'll get the note. And again, I'm so pleased to know you, Justin. I hope that you appreciate, we've got a really smart group of people here.
Oh, no, I am in awe. So thank you for the invitation.
Well, I think I mentioned to you that we get people like yourself with tremendous capability because you get an audience here that really wants to hear you, not like those 5 people at Oxford. So do plan on coming back. Take us home, Dr. Greene.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions left in the chat that I want to get to before we finish up at 6. One is about Bernard Power's book, Black Charlestonian says, quote, as objects of suspicion in the slaveholding South, free Blacks became painfully aware that their freedom was exercised only at the sufferance of whites, end quote. What do you think are the major sufferances facing Blacks today?
Oh, that is a good question. I mean, I think that the visibility, the presence of white supremacy continues to structure so much of American life, and I think in visible but oftentimes invisible ways. And I know that critical race theory has been thrust into public political discourse. But of course, we know that it was, it's a legal theory taught in law schools and not even mandatory. But I think that it is a powerful way to understand how race and racism and discrimination continues to infiltrate American institutions in often invisible ways. And again, I mean, I say it again, I think studying the racial wealth gap and economic inequality is one of those ways in which it is invisible but palpable if you are on the receiving end of it. And so, and this is why I think a critique about the history of capitalism is so important, because it helps us kind of peel the layers of this history and get to kind of the kernel of truth here, which is the intertwining of capitalism and slavery and the ways in which it has infiltrated American institutions and society. And so in many ways, Powers' book, and I love Black Charlestonians, it's a brilliant book. I think in many ways, Powers is kind of talking about this in I think an indirect way in which he positions free Blacks as really kind of struggling with what the realities of freedom was like within a slave society. And that was incredibly fraught, especially again in the 19th century.
Hmm. Now, with that being said, this is a really interesting question. What role did religion play in the relationship between capitalism and slavery?
Oh, that is a good question. I have to admit that I am not a religious studies scholar, even though I have read a bit about the influence of African religious traditions in Black communities, especially in the 18th century. Yeah, that I don't know. I mean, in many ways, I do wonder about the relationship, not religion broadly, but Christianity, right? The influence of the ways in which Christianity has converged with ideas of freedom and how that then has been implanted in conversations about capitalism, right? The kind of work hard, and live a life of freedom and liberty, however that may look, is incredibly fraught if you think about the ways in which this message was absorbed by the enslaved during the period of legal slavery. So, well, yeah. I mean, I think in an interesting way, I have thought more about the convergence of capitalism and religion now, especially in terms of the prosperity gospel, but in how that plays along lines of race and class. But yeah, no, I think your question about slavery, capitalism, and religion is an interesting one that I have to admit I haven't thought too much about, but I think it's a great question.
Now, I think this is going to likely be our last question for the evening before we wrap up here. You mentioned plantation owners' fears of slave resistance, including the breaking of machines. Can you briefly give examples of this happening?
Of say that last part again. Sorry, I was
Of
scrolling through
slaves,
the chat.
sorry. Can you mentioned plantation owners' fears of slave resistance, including the breaking of machines. Can you briefly give examples of this happening?
Of slaves breaking machines, for
Of slaves
example.
breaking machines, yes.
Sure. Well, I mean, interestingly enough, if you read the WPA narratives, especially the narratives from South Carolina, there are instances of formerly enslaved men and women talking about how slaves would slow down the pace of work, break certain tools, or specifically misplace certain tools to slow down the pace of work. And historians have claimed that this was a form of resistance to slavery, and perhaps was. But it was a way to kind of reject the power and control of the enslaver, surely. And so framing it in terms of resistance is of course useful, but I often think about it in terms of enslaved men and women finding ways to reject the power and control of their enslavers in potent ways.
All right. So I think that's probably it for questions this afternoon. And as you can see, we have for oh God, you had Omar, you had to put that in the chat, didn't you? Okay, so this is our final question. We gotta get out of here. Um, we must know Dr. Hill Edwards' thoughts on critical race theory, which I know you just mentioned a moment ago. Anything else you want to add to that?
I mean, I think it's being used as a political wedge to be divisive. I think that if one understands what critical race theory is from a scholarly and academic standpoint, and if one reads the literature, one, I think it would require a lot of time, energy, and focus because, again, these are mostly articles written in law school journals, which tend to be fairly dense and I think in important ways. But I think it is hard to say that most schools are teaching critical race theory, especially from a K to 12 level, because one, that's just not true. And two, what is wrong with saying that institutions that guide and shape American society are steeped in a culture, are steeped in a history where racism and slavery were deemed to be acceptable and embedded in American laws and institutions? If you look at the history, that is an unmistakable fact, right? It is plain and clear. But I think it has been used as a political wedge to prevent certain school districts from having to talk about decisive topics. And that is something that undermines, one, the goal of education, and two, it's infantilizing because what it assumes is that students cannot understand violence and brutality and inequality in our history. And one, that's not fair to them, but two, it is doing a disservice to what this real history of this country is. And it is not all about liberty, freedom, and triumph. It is about exploitation. It is about violence. And we can talk about kind of what happens on their end, but what ignoring ideas like critical race theory does is it underscores the idea that the arc of history bends towards justice. And I hate that term because I don't think it's true. I think that if we look at history, the forward progress of society, of civilizations, is often forged in violence. And it is important for us to understand that. So I hope that answers your question.
Oh, I think it definitely does. And again, I think it puts everything that we've talked about this afternoon into broader historical and cultural context. So everyone, please give Dr. Justene Hill Edwards a virtual hand of applause. This was a great presentation, a really important one. Brett, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, to tell people to unmute themselves and share their screen and clap for the woman.
Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you.
You know where you live now.
I know. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Oh, no, we were glad to have you. Now, a friendly reminder for folks, tomorrow at Justice School, we will have Dr. Catherine Adams, a colleague of mine at Claflin University, to talk a bit about resistance to slavery, resistance to the destruction of indigenous peoples by the indigenous themselves. It'll be a really important class that I think, again, as Dr. Edwards' presentation tonight really showed us, that these peoples had agency. They tried to work the best they could against this system of racial capitalism more broadly speaking, and really kind of get into that a bit more. Now, Brett, just a quick question. Are we having any sort of after class chat tonight like we do with the other sessions, or we're not doing that this evening?
Well, we can, but I would not. It's certainly up to you and Dr. Edwards whether you want to stay or not. I had not planned it, but because I think these people would keep asking questions until the cows came home.
Well,
keep them interested.
Yeah, I mean,
five more minutes until my daughter like knocks on the door and be like, okay, you've been in there for too long. Like me.
Well, I know we're going to definitely have a an after talk tomorrow night. So I know I have to run at 6 as well myself. Um, but yeah, this was a fantastic presentation. Again, I want to thank everyone for making it such a lively discussion as well. Thanks again to all those
Hard
who came out and
questions too. Ooh.
yeah,
Well, some of myself, our staff, and some of our board members can stay for those of you that have like a particular question about what we're doing. Some of you haven't been involved in what we're doing. Somebody just yesterday came to one of our events and said, I didn't know y'all did anything more than the school. Well, there's some people come to the school and don't know that we do that. Or so we're, as a great revolutionary once said, we have to be well shod on all 4 feet.
Makes sense.
So thank you, Dr. Edwards and Dr. Greene. It's 6 o'clock and you go take care of business, and everybody else can go home unless you got like a burning question or just want to stay and applaud. Bye, guys.
Yeah. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. You get your T-shirt, your honorarium check. It's coming. We got your
Thank you
address.
so much. I will wear it with pride. It was a good group.
I'm impressed with these folks. Part of the problem of the left liberal side of the world is that we try and convince everybody to agree with us, and there's so many different opinions.
Sure.
And on the right side of the world, the white guys get to make up all the rules, and it's really easy. And so we have a harder hand to play. And so we don't know whether there's actually people behind these things here.
Yeah.
Because there's Mr. Fox in person, and there's Mr. Fox not in person. So it may just be us. If anybody other than staff or an officer is here, say something, because we're going to let Dr. Hill Edwards go after we, I don't know whether Chris or Maury or Daniel has something to say, because her daughter's going to knock on the door in a minute.
This was a real pleasure. I hope the presentation wasn't too scattered, but I love this topic, so I could talk about it for so long.
It's such an encompassing issue.
I had a thought.
Go ahead, Maury.
Yeah, I was just curious how you navigate absorbing maybe some of the harsher aspects of the information. Like, do you pace yourself? Do you take a time out? Or are you able to kind of compartmentalize your academic mind from processing like what all this means to the people?
Yeah, that is a great question, and one that I often talk to my students about, especially students who work on the history of slavery. And I think what I've had to do, especially since I entered grad school, is think about this in terms of who's benefiting from this work. And so there is the work itself. But I realize that it is my doing of the work. It's the publications and the speaking engagements and things in the research that allows me this platform. And I feel really privileged to be able to read these sources and weave them together where people will read them and really engage with them. And I think that I'm in a really privileged position. And so that's really the perspective that I use, that if I can tell these stories, like, why not me to tell these stories? And so I use that as a way of saying, well, I'm uncovering and analyzing these histories and these stories so that other people, other readers, listeners can also engage with them as well. And I think it has helped me because at times, it's difficult to read about whippings and families being sold off and violence, but I do keep that in mind as well. And I mean, to be honest, a lot of what I read are kind of economic transactions as well. And so in some ways, the structure of my work, I'm not always into the kind of thinking about violence and exploitation. And I think that helps as well. I think if I was working on a slightly different topic, it might be more of a struggle. But, a lot of times I'm reading account books and kind of then interrogating how an enslaved person might feel if they are categorized in a certain way or given a certain value. And it's a different type of analysis, I think.
So much of what you lifted up the lid on, and this thing we're going to talk about, oh Lord, that's tomorrow. We have another class tomorrow. Is that the innovative and creative and clever methodology of getting by that those of us that were raised here and read the books they gave us, the ignorant, superstitious colored people, that was the way it was presented. What, the Downing School?
Oh, the Dunning School. Yeah.
And so it's good for us folks that were done in by the Downing School.
Yeah.
And are you teaching any undergraduate classes? Because that conversation you just had made me wonder who your classes are composed of.
Oh, mine? So I teach at the undergraduate and the graduate level. So I teach first year college students to graduate students. So it runs the gamut. Well, I am going to sign off, but I just want to say thank you again for the invitation and for engaging with the talk. I really appreciate it.
Do you think that you might be available to come back next time we have this class?
Yeah, I am here.
What's happened is the class just gets getting longer and longer and longer. we started out with, I think, 8 or 9 classes. We're up to like 18 now.
It's a semester's worth of classes, so that's good.
Yeah. But this graduate level will be once a year, but what we intended to do and are committed to doing is having short courses, skill sessions for people to know how to use the tools, because we're not just a history class. Well, thank you again. And we will be in touch. We will be in touch.
All right. Have a good night.